Florida State is taking a new approach to recruiting, more speed, and more speed. And it's reminiscent of Bobby Bowden and how he built the Noles. Today, we're going to talk about the recruits the Florida State Seminoles have in the fold and a few key players as well that Bowden would have loved.
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Seminoles. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football recruiting analyst and writer. Thank you for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. Truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. And today is one of my favorite subjects, recruiting from a broad base of how Florida State was built and catapulting that all the way forward to now. And quite honestly, Mike Norvell is mirroring what Bobby Bowden did in the late 70s all the way through the early 90s when they built the program on speed, and more speed. They didn't care about size. They cared about production. And my guy is faster than yours. He's twitchier than yours. We're going to beat you with our athleticism. He told you he was going to do it. He recruited those players. And then, yep, he did it. So let's talk about the commitments that the Noles have and why they do actually mirror a lot of what Bowden did. This is really fun for me because, again, watching Florida State growing up, they always had a little bit smaller player than somebody else at key spots, like linebacker, maybe a safety, definitely a receiver. But you just didn't catch them. They would beat a block to the outside and cut off a guy on a toss sweep, -2. They'd take a screen pass that you had covered, but he made 2 or 3 guys miss, get 20 yards, 1st and 10 Noles. They used speed. First guy is somebody that is really reminiscent of what Florida State did. Karan Maycock out of Miami Central. Watched some more film of him. I've talked to some more people. I'm really interested to see him at some different events this year, Under Armour, etc. I believe he is one of the better linebackers in the country. And ironically, he's a little bit underrated. He's a 3-star by some of the services, but whatever the case may be, I know that would not have bothered Bowden because one of the things that Norvell has done to this point in his career here, and I love this, Bowden always recruited based on what he thought. Wasn't worried about what other people did. Speed, and more speed. That's what they did. They outran everybody. Now, that's not like they didn't have big guys too, but the skill players, including linebacker, they were going to be faster than the team in front of them. They didn't apologize for it, and they basically told you that. Maycock is a great example of that as well. Roughly 200 pounds, 6'1", and he can run, and he's at Miami Central again. So competition certainly is not a concern. Miami, Florida State, maybe Bama, Arizona State, all kinds of schools have offered, but those schools are still going to keep knocking on his door. But he committed to Florida State early, despite Miami really wanting him, and despite an overture from numerous programs. Again, Florida State needs linebackers, obviously, based on last year, and getting a kid like this that is similar to what Bobby Bowden had, just pretty much the entire time that he was in Tallahassee is impressive. And to be a little more clear, for those of you who don't know, the 1980 Florida State team that wasn't that far from winning the national title, these are the kinds of kids they started with. They didn't get all just pure blue chippers right out of the gate when Bowden took over in the mid-70s. They had to build with speedy guys like this, and they took on Murderers Row, Ohio State, LSU, Nebraska, all these schools, mostly on the road, and they took kids like this and beat their butt more often than not. So it's a really cool thing to see Florida State circling around to that, even though Tony White's defense is a little different and they're going to run a 3-man line part of the time. A kid like this they can use in a lot of different ways, nickel, dime package, and definitely special teams. Now, if you're going to talk about a guy that I was really interested in growing up watching Florida State, Dexter Carter would be one, Snoop Menace. Obviously, there are a lot of running backs that were really athletic. But if you really think about Dexter Carter, he might have been the offensive skill player that really got the ball rolling. Mid-'80s through 1990, he was a guy at Florida State that just couldn't be tackled. Baxley, Georgia, Appling County High School, not the biggest area, and he certainly wasn't the biggest guy. He was in the 170-pound range when he came out of high school. Some schools didn't want him because they didn't think he was big enough to play running back. Bowden said, you know what? We can make that work here in Florida State, and we're going to make it work really, really well. When you had to try to tackle him in space, you had a hard time doing it. This next kid reminds me of that, although I think he'll play receiver or DB. But back then, Bowden might have tried this kid at running back, and that's Ephraim White. He's out of Vero Beach. He's a kid that's been committed for quite a while, 160, 170 pounds, and really twitchy. I'm not sure where he's going to play yet, but that's something Bowden didn't always know too. He brought him in, let him work out, go through practices, see how they adapted to the team and the schemes you had. And if an adjustment needed to be made, they did. Ephraim White is that kind of guy too. He's been on the scene for a long time, and playing at Vero, he's certainly played against competition, kind of like Maycock. He's not afraid to go up against anybody on either side of the ball. Really, really athletic kid, got some bounce to him. Like him a lot. And speaking of that, it's not that Florida State is short on these. Darion Williams is similar to Ephraim. He's at Plan High School in Tampa. That's a kid that tracks the ball about as well as any player in the class of 2026. Florida State has to keep recruiting him because everybody's still coming after him. But I don't know if I want him receiver. I don't know if I want him at DB. I like him on both sides of the ball. Don't care. Just get him on campus in Tallahassee, and then you figure it out. 180 pounds, give or take, is what I expect him to come into Florida State at. Maybe he ends up being a little bigger. It's hard to project. But another guy that's not the biggest kid in the world. But that's okay. If you can't tackle it because you can't hit it, it doesn't matter. Florida State looks at these kind of players in that way now, based on all the guys I got looking at the visit list, commitment list. It's a very obvious trend. Speed, speed, speed. I'm going to say that a few more times during the show, and I love it. Florida State fans should as well. They shouldn't ever be the team that is the slower football team on the field in the ACC. Maybe Clemson or Miami right there with them, but outside of that, really not. So Florida State needs more of it, and they need more of it, especially on defense, in my opinion, to run the scheme that Coach White wants to. And receiver, I think, in Florida kind of speaks for itself. But we'll see what Darion ends up playing. But he's another guy athletically like Snoop Menace, Dexter Carter, those guys that could have played on either side of the ball. And then those two ended up playing offense. Maybe Darion plays D. Whatever it is, you need athletes like this to compete at the highest level. Next up is a kid that Florida State is trying to get back into South Florida in a sense that's a little bit different than what I remember, because they didn't, even when they were just rolling and recruiting with top 3 classes every year, they didn't always get guys that commit very, very early. Darrell Bell certainly did. He's a kid from Barbara Goldman High School in the Hialeah area. I don't think Florida State's a lock to sign him because he's got a lot of schools coming after him, but they did get him to commit early. Safety, running back, receiver, he's a good enough athlete. They could put him at a spot, and it's something he's not played as near as much as the others, and he'd be able to figure it out. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a specific plan for him at Florida State, but just watching him move, it reminds me again of what Bowden did. That's fine. If they've got a spot for him and that's what he wants to play in at safety, have at it. But I think he's athletic enough to play receiver or running back. Maybe he plays nickel. And again, in today's world, defensively, Florida State needs more speed to be added to its roster. I believe he's really valuable because you could use him with a nickel or dime package in different roles, especially when teams go with tempo and they're putting out 3 and 4 wide receivers. You don't know where they're going to line up. This is a guy that can match. That's probably what I would do with him. Nickel's what I think of. But again, if it's safety, if it's receiver, whatever, that's cool. When we come back, we're going to continue on looking at the list of players that Florida State has committed and then talk about some key guys that got lined up for official visits, including one that is the epitome of how Bowden built the program in the 80s. That is next here on Locked on Seminoles. All right, Florida State fans, the future of college sports is here, and it's transparent. Before the Roy app, NIL negotiations often happened under the table. Fans didn't have a clear way to directly support the athletes they love. Now, with Roy, you get to be a part of the change and support Florida State athletes in the most transparent way possible. With the Roy app, it allows you to do the following. Choose the player you want to support, decide how much you want to contribute, and receive exclusive content from the athletes you back. The best part, if your players transfer, you get your money back. It's a risk-free way to show your support. The Roy app is giving fans control, no more uncertainty. Now you can provide transparent, impactful support and to help shape the team and the future of college sports with your contributions. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing Florida State athletes the way they deserve with transparency, trust, and real impact. There is the future of college sports with Roy. Join it now by downloading Roy and supporting your favorite Florida State players. Florida State not only has a lot of DBs and receivers that are committed that are reminiscent, but there's a running back that I've talked about a couple of times. And to be blunt, if he was at a bigger high school, he would have far more attention from the recruiting services. He plays at Mariana. For those of you that have been to a Florida State game and driven to Tallahassee, you may have driven by it. You may even live near it. But it's not the biggest school in the world. But Amari Clemens is athletic as all get out, and he is very much like Dexter Carter, just a slightly bigger build. But the first guy is going to struggle to hit him. And even if you do, he's a powerful guy that finds a way to get extra yards. I love this pickup for Florida State. He can catch the ball. He will run outside. He will beat you down the corner. He can run in so many different ways to beat you. Stop and start. I love this kind of player. I bet you he gets a look at kickoff and or punt return at some point during his career. And again, as I've said for the entire time that I have done this show, Florida State has to do a better job in the Florida Panhandle. Getting Clemens committed is certainly the right step to do that. Getting a guy like this that gets the football in his hands, it can be on all the sports shows, whatever channel you watch, whatever YouTube channel you're looking at, seeing highlights. When kids like this make plays, it helps you recruit that area. So getting a skill player like Amari is really important. Now, could he play defense? Absolutely. He's a physical kid. I could see him playing safety in a heartbeat. But because he's so good as a ball carrier, I'd imagine the Noles will be happy to leave him at running back. Also, Clemens is a guy that is still not done filling out. 200 pounds, 205. Yeah, I can see that. Again, if you wanted to move him to safety, you could, but there's really no reason as good a natural running back as he is. And he's less than 2 hours from home. He's in the Panhandle. I'd imagine Florida State will be very happy to see him enroll early next January and get him rolling pretty quick. Tadarius Hughes, DB out of South Dade. This is one of the tradition-rich programs in South Florida. He can really run, but he's also a hitter, and he's got length. Some of the guys that Florida State started getting, especially as you got in towards the middle of the 1990s, they got more length, they got more speed. Peter Bourware and all these different guys from the very front to the back of the defense, etc. But they had more length than they used to get early on in Bowden's tenure. Well, Hughes kind of fits that. He's 6'2", 6'3", and you could put him at free safety. You could probably play him at corner in a zone defense, but he's really, really athletic regardless of what you want to do with him. Florida State's going to have to battle to keep him. Miami, Syracuse, and a whole bunch of other schools still coming after him, but he's yet another guy that committed really early to the Florida State Seminoles. Looking at the final few kids here, as far as the commitments go, there's another trend. They know they've got to hit the offensive line. They've got a bunch of official visits that I've talked about here, but they do have Xavier Payne committed. I saw him for a second time here recently at Under Armour this past weekend, and he had dropped weight. He looked quicker, and he did much better than he did the last time I'd seen him. He's taking steps, and you can't teach 315 pounds and 6'6". Great guy. Really personable. He would fit into any school he went to. Florida State needs massive guys that can move, and his footwork's a lot better than what I thought it was after seeing him for a second time. Florida State didn't always get guys like this. This was probably the spot they, I would say, struggled the most in recruiting. Back then, not that they really struggled a ton, but offensive line. It's probably been the biggest thing for Florida State historically. When they didn't get over the top, it was O-line. Getting kids like Xavier Payne, get him through the program for a couple of years is important. We'll see if he sticks. Florida State's got to battle Syracuse, Penn State, Arkansas. I'd watch out for the Nittany Lions in particular. Those are some of his other official visits in conjunction with Florida State getting the June 20th and final visit. But that's a really big guy that can be a power football player. Kind of fits Gus Malzahn's offense. All these speedy guys can only do so much if they don't have the ability to have somebody in front of them to block. Finally, on the recruitment front, you're seeing this trend with Florida State and everybody else. Even if they commit, the Florida kids are going to take visits. All the kids committed to the Noles, all of them have visits lined up somewhere else. Bowden played this game too. He was just the absolute closer of closers in the late part of the cycle. Now, it used to be February and it's now December, but it's the same principle. Personality, relationships, and selling what they were going to do. He was just straightforward. Parents loved him. The coaches enjoyed coaching with him. He gave them a lot of rope to do it their way to promote themselves. And Florida State won far more than they lost on these big recruitment battles that went into the last week. Florida State's going to have to do that with this group, Mike Norvell and his staff, because so many of these kids I'm talking about, they're great players, but they can still end up going other places. That's just part of it. And to that point, I'm going to go over a kid that kind of embodies this overall theme. And then we'll get into a couple other really key players. But Cameron Wilson, pass rusher, Southridge High School in Miami. Now, he's not a quote-unquote mainstream guy, but he's starting to really blow up in his official visit list. While unusual, I have a feeling it's going to adjust again. 6'4", 215, athletic, can play weak side. Maybe he grows into a strong side edge, but he can play weak side, and there's never enough pass rushers. Coming from the Miami Public League, that also helps. But these are the kinds of kids that Bowden made a living off of. Again, especially during the early portion of his tenure at Florida State University. They didn't always get the elite kid right out of the gate. This kid's official visit list: Minnesota, Cal, Syracuse, and Florida State. He asked NC State to move Florida State in for the June 20th weekend. That's going to be a big weekend for the Noles. This is the kind of kid you had to get. You bring him in and redshirt him, and they get bigger and stronger. And, of course, you got to coach him up, and the rest takes care of itself. Bernard Wilson was a kid like this to a certain degree. Now, he was higher rated, but he needed a year to kind of get his footing. Then as a sophomore, he started to take off. They ended up being an NFL player, first-round pick of the Bengals. You've got to have guys with this length and this kind of athleticism, and it doesn't hurt that he's another Miami public school kid. It's really important. When we come back, we're going to talk about the official visit list, just a handful of guys that, again, that kind of, when you look at it, it's speed, and it really is reminiscent of what Bowden did, and it's why I got into recruiting. That is next here on Locked On Seminoles. Life moves fast, especially when you have a family. One day you're watching your kids take their first steps, and before you know it, they're off to college. That's why securing the future is so important. Fabric by Gender Life makes it simple to get term life insurance that fits your family's needs. With Fabric, you can apply term life insurance online right from your couch. You could be covered in under 10 minutes, and in many cases, no health exam is required. As a parent, you're going to want to make sure your family is financially protected. No matter what happens, Fabric gives you that opportunity to have peace of mind. It's also an affordable piece of coverage. You can get $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day, so protecting your loved ones doesn't have to break the bank. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help them protect their families. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. That's meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. Policies issued by Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. Speaking of speed, we have a lot of talented players in the state of Florida, but the edge rusher spot, and depending on what Florida State's going to call it, the jack spot is what it was at Nebraska, that stand-up outside linebacker pass rusher role. I think they need to take two in this class. They've previously had Isaiah Williams committed. He's a kid that could still end up at Florida State. Alabama and Georgia and FSU are the three schools I've heard the most with him. Here recently, he's the kid out of a high school just north of Orlando and Tavares, but I don't care what high school he's at, the way he runs. I saw him at Under Armour again, and I've seen him perform multiple times. Really athletic kid. That's a guy they've got a great shot at, top 100 kind of recruit. Let's see if they can get him. The other guy is Trenton Henderson from Pensacola Catholic. As I was just talking about, Bernard Wilson, I've talked about Peter Boulware. These 215-pound to 225-pound guys, Florida State was the absolute best at finding them under the Bowden regime and just taking teams out with pass rush. You got in third and long, they could drop 7, sometimes 8, and still get a pass rush on you without blitzing. as a quarterback, it's over with. Florida State has a shot at Trenton. They've got a shot at Isaiah. If they can get at least one, if they got both, they'd be absolutely lock, stock, and barrel, especially after this pass class. They got some guys like that too. They would stack classes at the critical pass rushing positions. And you're not going to win big again until you do. And these guys are in their backyard. You're going to have to beat Miami. You're going to have to beat Florida, etc. But these are really good football players. I know Miami's trying to get back in on Isaiah. They're not going to get a visit right now. Florida probably will. They're the other school I'd wonder about. Florida State, Alabama, Georgia, probably my picks. Oklahoma, Texas is involved with Zay, but we'll see if they even get an OV. Long way to go with these kids, but these speed, twitchy edge rushers, that's a spot Florida State is famous with. Let's see if they can get it done. Xavier Larice just committed to Oregon. Now, Bowden didn't always win every recruiting battle right up front. Sometimes school would win, Georgia, Tennessee, whatever, and they would continue to recruit. One of the things that I'm monitoring this year, how well does Florida State go after these speedy athletes like Larice? He's receiver, DB, nickel, punt returner, kick returner. He's another one of those guys who can play anything. He is from O'Galley in Melbourne, Florida, and national recruit. He's got a visit set with Florida State. We'll see if he still takes it. He just committed to Oregon, as I noted a moment ago. But let's see if Florida State can get him on campus for an unofficial this spring and then continue on and get the OV. If you go down swinging with that, it is what it is. If the kid still wants to go to Oregon, that's his business. But these are some of the keys to winning and recruiting. Longevity, consistency, not getting mad about it, and not calling the kid for a couple of weeks. Linear. You got to continue on just like it's another day. Norvell has been pretty consistent about that himself as a recruiter. I do know that. But now this staff has to do that too. Larice is one of the best players in the state of Florida. Just because he's at O'Galley and that's not right in the middle of Tampa, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, doesn't diminish what he can do. His film is nasty. He is a big-time player. And again, I've said it several times on the show today, more speed on defense is important. And again, on top of that, speed, and more speed is what Bowden did. Larice has really good speed. It's not just the kids that play DB or receiver running back. A kid that's a really good athlete that Florida State back in the 80s or early 90s would have liked, Ben Mobinga. He's got lined up a visit to Noles, June 20th. And that's a really important time. But they're also in a situation where they're going to be competing with some really good programs. LSU, NC State, Arkansas, and several others are taking a look at him. We'll see if he ends up taking the OV to Florida State and loving it enough to be a commitment. He's from Buford. That's a really good program in the state of Georgia. I think that you need some really twitchy tackles. That's something Florida State's missed on, and that's what he is. It's not a finished product, but again, that's kind of similar to what Bowden did, and I'm okay with that. And finally, the player that I'm curious to see how his recruitment goes, I've heard Florida State has the edge, and that's Chauncey Kinnon, DB out of Booker High School in Sarasota. Athletic, length, all the intangibles. Georgia, Florida State, I've heard Miami really wants him, and the list is forever. 24/7, I believe, has him as the number one corner in the country. But whoever it is that he ends up signing with is going to get a guy that's going to play early. He can play free safety or receiver too. Again, that fits the Bowden mold to a T. In-state kid, national battle. These are the ones that Bowden won when he got the program rolling. And if Florida State wants to get back to that, that's what they got to do. Thank you once again for making Locked On Seminoles your first listen each and every day. Truly appreciate you stopping in to talk some Noles with me. Please hit that like button and that notification bell and share this podcast. I appreciate it. Everybody have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon.